Sometimes the most dangerous doors are never locked because they are meant to protect a memory, not a secret. Rain drummed softly against the tall windows of the Calloway estate as Jasmine Brooks hurried through the silent hallway with a stack of freshly folded towels balanced carefully in her arms. She had been working at the mansion for only 5 days, yet she had already learned 2 important lessons. The first was that every room sparkled with impossible perfection, from the polished walnut floors to the crystal chandeliers that reflected warm golden light across endless corridors. The second was that everyone avoided the 3rd floor without asking questions. Whenever Jasmine mentioned cleaning the upper hallway, the other housekeepers exchanged nervous glances before quietly changing the subject. Sophia Reynolds, the estate manager, had offered only one instruction. If you ever find yourself upstairs, finish your work quickly and never open the last door on the east wing. Jasmine had nodded politely, believing it was simply another household rule in a mansion filled with expensive antiques and private offices. That evening, however, a sudden storm swept across the estate, rattling old windows and causing several employees to rush through the house, securing curtains before the wind could carry rain inside. Sophia asked Jasmine to deliver fresh towels to one of the guest suites, while everyone else attended to the unexpected weather. Trying not to delay, Jasmine climbed the wide staircase and followed the dimly lit hallway. The sound of rain echoed through the old house, while lightning briefly illuminated portraits that watched silently from the walls. Halfway down the corridor, she noticed 2 nearly identical doors standing only a few feet apart. Believing she had reached the correct room, she gently pushed one open without knocking. The scent of cedarwood and old books greeted her first. The room felt nothing like the modern luxury found throughout the rest of the mansion. Shelves filled with worn novels lined the walls. A grand piano rested beside a fireplace where a single lamp cast a warm glow across carefully framed family photographs. Fresh white lilies stood beneath a portrait of a smiling woman whose gentle expression somehow filled the room with quiet peace. Jasmine had barely taken one step inside when a calm voice broke the silence behind her. "Walk into my room like that again." Her heart nearly stopped. She turned quickly and found Ethan Calloway standing near the doorway, still wearing his charcoal suit from a long day away from the estate. Rainwater glistened on his dark coat, while his steady blue eyes met hers without anger, yet with unmistakable authority. Jasmine froze, gripping the towels tightly against her chest. Every story she had overheard about the cold Mafia boss rushed through her mind at once. Before Ethan could finish speaking, another crack of thunder shook the windows. Startled and embarrassed, Jasmine hurried past him, whispering a breathless apology she doubted he even heard. As she disappeared down the hallway, Ethan quietly sighed and glanced toward the open door. After knocking first, he finished to an empty corridor. His unfinished sentence faded into the sound of falling rain. Downstairs, Jasmine leaned against the kitchen wall, her pulse still racing. She was convinced she had narrowly escaped a serious mistake. In her mind, the warning had sounded less like a request and more like a promise. Across the mansion, Ethan gently closed the bedroom door before walking toward the framed portrait beside the lilies. He adjusted one flower that had begun to lean and allowed a faint, almost invisible smile to touch his face. "I did not mean to frighten her," he murmured quietly. Outside, the storm continued washing over the estate while 2 people, separated by only a few rooms, carried completely different versions of the same moment into the long night ahead, unaware that one interrupted sentence had already begun changing both of their lives. The following morning the storm had vanished, leaving the Calloway estate wrapped in crisp autumn sunshine that spilled across polished marble floors and towering windows. Jasmine Brooks woke earlier than everyone else, determined to prove that one embarrassing mistake would never define her place in the household. She moved quietly from room to room, carefully arranging fresh flowers, polishing antique tables, and greeting every employee with the same warm smile she had offered on her first day. Yet no matter how hard she tried to focus on her work, her thoughts kept returning to the unfinished warning she believed Ethan Calloway had given her. Each time she looked toward the grand staircase leading to the 3rd floor, she quickly looked away again. By lunchtime, the story had already begun spreading among a few members of the staff, although no one knew exactly what had happened. One housekeeper whispered that Mr. Calloway never allowed anyone near his private room. Another insisted that even longtime employees had never crossed that doorway. Jasmine listened quietly without adding a single word. The less she explained, the more mysterious the incident seemed to become. Sophia Reynolds eventually found her arranging books inside the main library. Without looking up from the inventory list in her hands, Sophia spoke gently. "You accidentally opened the east bedroom yesterday." Jasmine nodded with visible embarrassment. "I am so sorry. It will never happen again." Sophia finally looked at her and offered a reassuring smile. "Mr. Calloway did not ask me to discipline you." Jasmine blinked in surprise. "He did not." "No. In fact, he asked whether you were all right after the storm." Jasmine stared silently for a moment, uncertain whether she had heard correctly. The image she had built in her mind of an unforgiving employer suddenly became a little less certain. Later that afternoon, Ethan returned from a series of meetings downtown. As usual, he greeted the household staff with a quiet nod before heading toward his study. While passing through the sunroom, he noticed Jasmine carefully trimming the stems of fresh white lilies before placing them into a crystal vase. She handled each flower with remarkable patience, gently removing damaged leaves before arranging every blossom so that none overshadowed another. Ethan stopped without announcing himself. "Why lilies?" he asked. Jasmine turned quickly, surprised to find him standing nearby. "They last longer if they are cared for properly," she answered softly, "and they make a room feel peaceful without asking for attention." Ethan looked at the flowers for several thoughtful seconds. "Someone once told me exactly that." Before Jasmine could respond, he quietly continued walking down the hallway, leaving her even more confused than before. That evening, while delivering freshly pressed suits to the dressing room outside Ethan's private quarters, Jasmine noticed the east hallway door standing slightly open. She immediately lowered her eyes and placed the garments neatly outside without taking another step. As she turned to leave, Ethan's calm voice reached her from inside the room. "Thank you for knocking this time." Jasmine froze before slowly looking toward the doorway. Ethan stood several feet inside the room with the same composed expression as always, yet there was the faintest trace of kindness in his eyes. Embarrassed, she managed a small smile. "I learned my lesson." Ethan gave a nearly invisible nod. "Most people do not." She continued downstairs carrying an unexpected sense of relief, while Ethan quietly closed the door once more. Neither of them realized that the misunderstanding born during the storm had not created distance between them at all. Instead, it had become the first quiet conversation in a relationship that was beginning to grow through patience, respect, and the gentle discovery that first impressions are often the least truthful stories people tell themselves. Several days passed, and life inside the Calloway estate gradually settled into a peaceful rhythm that almost made Jasmine forget the awkward encounter on the third floor. Every sunrise found her opening tall windows to welcome fresh autumn air into the quiet mansion. Every afternoon, she worked alongside the gardeners, trimming roses and replacing seasonal flowers with careful hands that treated every living thing with gentle respect. The estate itself seemed to respond to her presence. Hallways once filled only with silence now carried the faint scent of fresh lilies and polished cedar. Even longtime employees admitted that the enormous house somehow felt brighter. Ethan noticed the changes without anyone pointing them out. He never commented on the newly arranged flowers or the neatly restored reading corner inside the library, but his eyes lingered on those small details longer than before. One evening, after returning from another demanding day in the city, Ethan walked through the West Garden instead of heading directly inside. The setting sun painted long shadows across the stone pathways while a cool breeze carried the fragrance of blooming roses. From a distance, he noticed Jasmine kneeling beside an elderly gardener whose hands trembled too much to replant a row of white lilies. Without hesitation, she gently took over the work while patiently listening to the older man share stories about the estate from decades earlier. She laughed quietly at his memories, never rushing him, never checking the time, making him feel as though his stories still mattered. Ethan remained beneath the old maple tree, watching unnoticed. Most people spoke differently whenever they knew he was nearby. Jasmine did not. Her kindness appeared exactly the same whether anyone important witnessed it or not. As dusk settled over the gardens, The elderly gardener slowly stood and thanked her before heading home. Jasmine stayed behind to water the last flower bed, humming softly to herself. She never noticed Ethan approaching until his shadow stretched across the pathway beside her. Startled, she straightened immediately. "Good evening, Mr. Calloway." Ethan looked down at the newly planted lilies. "You have been taking care of these every day." Jasmine nodded. Flowers remember consistency. They bloom better when someone refuses to give up on them. Ethan looked toward the garden in thoughtful silence. "My mother believed that." Jasmine lowered the watering can, surprised once again by how often his mother seemed connected to the lilies. Before she could ask another question, Ethan quietly stepped toward one of the flower beds and gently adjusted a small wooden marker that had tilted after the recent rain. His movements were careful, almost reverent, revealing a tenderness completely different from the composed businessman everyone else knew. "She planted the first lilies here herself," he said, softly. "Every fall she insisted they deserved another season, even when everyone else believed they were finished." Jasmine listened without interrupting. She sensed he was sharing something deeply personal, something few people had ever been allowed to hear. After a long pause, Ethan looked toward the fading sunset. "The room upstairs is connected to her," he admitted. "That is why I protect it." Jasmine's heart tightened with quiet understanding. For the first time, she realized the closed door had never hidden arrogance or pride. It had protected cherished memories that grief had made fragile. "I am sorry I misunderstood," she said sincerely. Ethan offered a small, genuine smile that disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared. Most people do. As darkness slowly settled across the estate, they stood together in comfortable silence, surrounded by white lilies gently swaying beneath the evening breeze. Neither of them realized that the distance created by one unfinished sentence was beginning to disappear, replaced instead by something far stronger than curiosity, the quiet beginning of trust. A week later, an unexpected autumn storm swept across the countryside once again, bringing heavy rain that echoed through the glass roof above the eastern wing of the Calloway estate. Shortly after sunset, Sophia hurried into the dining room where Ethan was finishing a late dinner while Jasmine organized fresh linens nearby. "Mr. Calloway," Sophia said with quiet urgency, "the skylight above the third floor has begun leaking. The maintenance crew cannot reach the estate until tomorrow morning." Ethan immediately set down his coffee. "Move everything that could be damaged." Without another word, he headed upstairs. Jasmine instinctively followed several steps behind, carrying clean cloths and storage boxes before anyone could ask. When they reached the private room at the end of the hallway, rainwater had begun dripping steadily through one corner of the ceiling onto the hardwood floor. Ethan quickly opened several cabinets and carefully lifted framed photographs away from the moisture. Jasmine noticed his movements were unusually gentle, completely different from the calm confidence he displayed in business meetings. Every object he touched seemed priceless, not because of money, but because of memory. Without speaking, she quietly placed soft towels beneath the leaking glass before carrying empty boxes toward him. Ethan paused for only a moment before handing her the first framed photograph. "Please hold this carefully." Jasmine accepted it with both hands. The picture showed a younger Ethan sitting beside his mother on a wooden garden bench surrounded by blooming white lilies. His serious expression had already begun forming even as a little boy, but the woman beside him smiled warmly enough for both of them. Jasmine carefully wrapped the frame in protective cloth before placing it inside a storage box. One by one they worked together, moving old books, handwritten journals, music sheets, and family keepsakes away from the rain. The room slowly revealed itself not as a luxurious bedroom, but as a sanctuary preserving the people Ethan loved most. There were shelves filled with letters written in elegant handwriting, a worn cardigan folded neatly over a reading chair, and an antique music box resting beside the grand piano. Nothing appeared arranged for display. Everything remained exactly where it had once been left, as though time itself had quietly stopped inside these walls. When the final box had been moved to safety, Jasmine noticed Ethan standing silently before the portrait above the fireplace. She hesitated before speaking. "Your mother loved this room very much." Ethan kept his eyes on the portrait. "She designed every part of it herself." His voice carried neither sadness nor bitterness, only quiet honesty. After a long pause, he continued. "When she became ill, This was the room where we spent our evenings reading together. After she passed away, everyone suggested renovating it. They believed it would help me move forward. He slowly shook his head. I could never do it. If this room changed, I was afraid I would lose the last place where I could still remember her exactly as she was. Jasmine looked around the softly lit room with entirely different eyes. The warning she had misunderstood on her first night suddenly felt almost heartbreaking. Ethan had never been protecting a private space from other people. He had been protecting precious memories from the fear of losing them forever. Jasmine stepped closer to the windows and gently closed the curtains against the rain. Memories do not disappear because someone else sees them, she said quietly. Sometimes they become even stronger when they are shared with someone who respects them. Ethan turned toward her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, the rain slowly faded into a gentle drizzle while the room grew peaceful once again. Ethan looked around the space that no one had entered willingly for years, then back at Jasmine, who had handled every photograph and every keepsake with the same care she gave the smallest flower in the garden. Something inside him quietly shifted. For the first time since his mother's passing, the room no longer felt like a place he had to guard alone. The storm passed during the night, leaving the Callaway estate wrapped in cool morning mist that slowly lifted as sunlight spread across the gardens. By breakfast, workers had already begun repairing the damaged skylight, while inside the mansion life quietly returned to its familiar routine. Yet something had changed in ways no one could quite explain. Ethan no longer hurried through every hallway with the same emotional distance that had once surrounded him. More than once he found himself pausing to notice details that had escaped his attention for years. The reading room smelled faintly of fresh lilies again. The old piano reflected morning light after Jasmine had carefully polished its surface. Even the portraits along the corridor seemed brighter simply because someone had taken the time to clean each frame with patience instead of routine. That afternoon, Ethan stepped into the gardens carrying a pair of leather gardening gloves, surprising every employee who watched from the windows. He rarely spent time outside unless attending formal events. Yet now he walked directly toward the section where white lilies had struggled after the recent storm. Jasmine was already there, kneeling beside the flower beds, gently pressing fresh soil around several young plants whose roots had become exposed during the heavy rain. She looked up, visibly surprised to see him. "Good afternoon, Mr. Callaway." Ethan held up the extra pair of gloves. "I was told lilies recover faster if someone refuses to give up on them." Jasmine smiled, immediately recognizing her own words from days earlier. "That depends on who is taking care of them." Ethan quietly slipped on the gloves before kneeling beside her for the first time. The sight alone caused two gardeners to exchange astonished glances from across the pathway. For the next hour, they worked side by side beneath the gentle autumn sun, carefully straightening broken stems, replacing damaged supports, and planting several new rows where the rain had washed the soil away. Conversation came naturally now, without awkward pauses or forced politeness. Jasmine spoke about growing vegetables with her grandmother during childhood summers, while Ethan shared small stories about helping his mother choose flowers every spring, admitting that he had never remembered their proper names until she patiently taught him one by one. At one point, Jasmine noticed a small ceramic watering pitcher resting near the edge of the garden, decorated with hand-painted lilies that had faded with age. "Your mother painted this herself, did she not?" she asked softly. Ethan looked at the pitcher for a long moment before nodding. She believed beautiful things should be used instead of hidden away. Jasmine gently filled it with water and handed it back to him. Then she would probably be happy to see it in the garden again. Ethan accepted the pitcher without speaking, but something warm settled quietly inside him. Later that evening, while the staff prepared dinner, Sophia found Ethan standing alone in the conservatory overlooking the restored flower beds. "The estate feels different lately," she observed. Ethan watched the breeze move gently through the lilies before answering. "No." He smiled almost imperceptibly. "The estate feels like itself again." Upstairs, Jasmine paused outside the east wing before continuing her evening rounds. The once intimidating hallway no longer filled her with uncertainty. She knew what waited behind the final door now, not danger or anger, but cherished memories protected by love. As the last rays of sunlight faded beyond the gardens, Ethan remained by the window, watching the white lilies sway peacefully together. He suddenly realized that for the first time in many years, he no longer visited the garden simply to remember his mother. He had begun looking forward to sharing it with someone who understood why those memories deserved to keep blooming. Several peaceful weeks slipped by, and the Callaway estate slowly transformed in ways no architect could ever have designed. The changes were almost impossible to measure, yet everyone who worked there quietly noticed them. The grand halls no longer echoed with nothing but footsteps. Fresh flowers appeared on tables that had remained empty for years. The library windows stayed open each morning to welcome crisp autumn air, and soft piano melodies occasionally drifted through the eastern wing during quiet afternoons. Ethan had not asked for any of those changes, yet he never asked for them to stop. One bright afternoon, a distinguished visitor arrived at the estate, introducing himself as Charles Whitmore, a respected collector of historical furniture and family heirlooms. He claimed he had known Ethan's late mother years earlier and politely requested permission to view several antique pieces that had once belonged to her private collection. Sophia welcomed the guest into the reception room, while Ethan finished a conference call upstairs. Jasmine carried a tray of tea into the sitting room and quietly placed delicate porcelain cups before the visitor. As she turned to leave, her eyes briefly rested on an old leather notebook Charles had placed beside his briefcase. Tucked inside the notebook was a faded photograph showing the very same music box that still rested inside Ethan's private room. Something about the image felt strangely wrong. The photograph identified the music box as part of a European estate auction that had taken place many years after Ethan's mother had already owned it. Jasmine did not interrupt the conversation, but the inconsistency remained. In her mind, when Ethan joined them a few minutes later, Charles warmly complimented the estate before expressing great admiration for the preserved collection upstairs. "Your mother possessed remarkable taste," he said with practiced confidence. "I would be honored to purchase several of her personal keepsakes so they may be displayed in my private gallery." Ethan listened politely but offered no immediate answer. Jasmine quietly refilled the teacups, her thoughts returning to the photograph. After the meeting ended, she found Ethan walking alone through the conservatory. She hesitated before speaking. "May I ask you something?" Ethan nodded. "Of course." Jasmine carefully explained what she had noticed. "The photograph inside Mr. Whitmore's notebook showed your mother's music box, but the date printed beneath it did not make sense. If she already owned it years earlier, it could not have appeared in the auction he mentioned. Perhaps it was only a mistake, but I thought you should know." Ethan remained silent for several moments before quietly thanking her. Curious, he contacted the family archivist later that afternoon and requested copies of old purchase records his mother had carefully preserved. By evening, the answer became clear. The music box had indeed been purchased directly from a local artisan decades before the auction Charles had described. The collector had unknowingly revealed that he had relied on inaccurate information rather than genuine knowledge of Ethan's family history. The following morning, Ethan politely declined the proposed sale, choosing instead to keep every keepsake exactly where it belonged. As Charles departed, Ethan thanked him courteously for visiting, never mentioning the inconsistency Jasmine had uncovered. Later, standing together beside the white lilies, Ethan looked toward the quiet gardens before speaking. "Most people see antiques." He smiled gently. "You saw memories." Jasmine lowered her eyes with a modest smile. "Some things are worth more than they appear." Ethan looked at her for a long moment, realizing she had protected something priceless without expecting recognition, praise, or reward. In that quiet autumn garden, surrounded by flowers lovingly restored through patient hands, Ethan understood that trust was no longer something he merely offered Jasmine. It had become something he felt completely whenever she was near, and for the first time in many years, the future no longer seemed like a place he would have to face alone. The final weeks of autumn painted the Callaway estate in warm shades of amber and gold, and every passing day quietly revealed how much had changed without either Ethan or Jasmine ever speaking about it directly. The invisible boundaries that had once divided the mansion no longer existed. Jasmine now carried fresh flowers into the east wing each morning without hesitation, always knocking gently before entering. Ethan would simply look up from the old desk where he often read his mother's journals and answer with the same quiet invitation. "Come in." The room that had once been surrounded by silence gradually became the most peaceful place in the estate. Some mornings Jasmine arranged fresh lilies beneath the portrait above the fireplace, while Ethan carefully dusted the shelves filled with worn novels his mother had loved. Other afternoons they sat near the grand piano sharing tea without feeling the need to fill every moment with conversation. The silence between them no longer felt uncomfortable. Instead, it carried the quiet understanding that only two people who genuinely respected one another could share. One cool afternoon, Ethan unlocked a narrow cedar cabinet built into the library wall and removed a small brass key hanging from a faded blue ribbon. Jasmine looked at it curiously but said nothing. Ethan turned the key thoughtfully in his hand before offering it to her. "Would you hold this for me?" She accepted it carefully. "What does it open?" Ethan smiled softly. "Every room on the third floor." Jasmine looked surprised. "I thought only you carried those keys." Ethan nodded. "Until now, that was true." She immediately tried to return it. "I do not think I should have this." Ethan gently closed her fingers around the key instead. Trust is not something that becomes real after it is spoken. It becomes real after it is shared. Jasmine lowered her eyes, touched by the quiet sincerity in his voice. Later that afternoon, Sophia noticed Jasmine walking calmly through the east hallway carrying fresh flowers, the brass key resting safely inside her apron pocket. The estate manager paused in visible surprise before smiling to herself. In all the years she had worked for the Calloway family, no employee had ever been entrusted with unrestricted access to the private wing. The change spoke louder than any announcement ever could. That evening, Ethan found Jasmine standing beside the library window watching the first leaves drift gently across the gardens. "Do you ever miss your old neighborhood?" he asked. Jasmine smiled thoughtfully. "I miss the people, but I think every place becomes home when someone makes you feel welcome." Ethan quietly looked toward the gardens where white lilies still bloomed despite the cooling weather. "I spent years believing that protecting memories meant locking doors." He paused before continuing. "You taught me that memories grow stronger when they are shared with someone who truly cares." Jasmine met his eyes for only a moment before looking back toward the fading sunset, afraid her own feelings might become too obvious if she looked any longer. Deep inside, she had begun to realize that the estate no longer represented only a job. It had become the place where she had discovered kindness hidden beneath quiet strength and loneliness transformed into hope. Neither of them noticed how naturally they now walked side by side through every hallway that had once separated their worlds. Somewhere between one unfinished sentence, a room filled with cherished memories, and a garden of patiently restored lilies, two guarded hearts had slowly learned to trust without fear. Yet beyond the peaceful walls of the estate, an unexpected opportunity was already making its way toward Jasmine, one that would quietly ask her to choose between the future she had always imagined and the home she had never expected to find. The first snow of the season arrived quietly, covering the gardens of the Calloway estate with a thin layer of white that rested gently upon the rows of lilies now sleeping beneath the winter soil. The mansion looked peaceful from the outside, yet inside its warm walls an unexpected letter waited on the breakfast table beside Jasmine's cup of tea. It bore the seal of the Harrison Cultural Foundation in Boston, one of the country's most respected organizations dedicated to preserving historic homes and gardens. Jasmine unfolded the letter slowly, her eyes widening as she read each line. Months before accepting her position at the estate, she had applied for a fellowship that combined historical preservation with community outreach, never expecting to receive a reply. Now the foundation was offering her a full-time position beginning in 3 weeks, complete with housing, professional training, and an opportunity she had dreamed about for years. Sophia noticed the expression on Jasmine's face almost immediately. "Good news?" she asked warmly. Jasmine forced a small smile and nodded. "It is everything I once hoped for." Yet even as she spoke those words, her heart felt strangely heavy. Later that afternoon, she walked alone through the snow-covered gardens, the letter folded carefully inside her coat pocket. Every familiar path reminded her of moments she had never planned to treasure. The bench where the elderly gardener had shared stories from decades past. The flower beds where Ethan had planted lilies beside her with soil still clinging to his gloves. The conservatory windows where they had watched autumn leaves drift across the lawn. Without realizing it, She had begun measuring time not by days or seasons, but by quiet conversations and shared silences that had slowly become the brightest part of her life. Inside the library, Ethan noticed she seemed unusually distracted. She still smiled politely, but her thoughts wandered somewhere beyond the pages of the books she carefully arranged. That evening he found her standing beside the grand piano in the East Wing, gently dusting its polished surface long after her work had already been finished. "Is something troubling you?" he asked softly. Jasmine hesitated before handing him the letter. Ethan read every word in complete silence. It was an extraordinary opportunity, one any talented person would accept without hesitation. He looked up and offered the answer he believed she deserved to hear. "You should go." Jasmine searched his face, hoping to find even the smallest reason to stay. Instead, she found only kindness wrapped inside quiet restraint. "Do you really mean that?" she asked. Ethan nodded slowly. Dreams should never be abandoned because they become difficult to leave behind. His voice remained calm, but every word felt heavier than the one before it. Jasmine smiled with grateful sadness. "Thank you." Neither of them spoke again. The following days passed with gentle normalcy that somehow made every ordinary moment feel precious. They shared morning tea, tended the winter greenhouse, and arranged books in the library exactly as they always had. Yet both quietly understood that every routine now carried the weight of an approaching farewell. On the evening before Jasmine planned to leave, she carefully polished the brass key Ethan had entrusted to her weeks earlier. She placed it inside a small velvet pouch and set it neatly upon the library desk before walking slowly through the silent east hallway one final time. She paused outside the room that had once frightened her, gently touching the doorframe with quiet gratitude before continuing downstairs. From the window of his study, Ethan watched snowflakes drift through the gardens where white lilies would bloom again in the spring. For the first time since opening his heart to another person, he understood that love sometimes remained completely silent, not because it lacked courage, but because it feared becoming the reason someone gave up the future they had worked so hard to build. Yet as the lights dimmed across the peaceful estate, neither of them realized that the quiet goodbye they were preparing for would soon become the very moment that finally revealed everything left unsaid. Morning arrived beneath a sky as clear as polished glass, and the Callaway estate stood quietly beneath a blanket of fresh snow. Jasmine carried her single suitcase through the grand foyer while every member of the household gathered to wish her well. Sophia embraced her warmly before, slipping a small packet of lily seeds into her hand. "Plant these wherever life takes you," she whispered. "A part of this home will always bloom with you." Jasmine smiled through grateful tears before thanking everyone who had become like family during the past months. She stepped outside into the crisp winter air, where the waiting car stood ready to take her to the train station. Before opening the door, she looked back one final time at the mansion whose towering windows now reflected the pale morning sun. Every memory returned at once. The unfinished warning that had frightened her, the rainstorm that had revealed a room filled with love instead of fear, the afternoons spent restoring lilies, the quiet conversations that had slowly transformed strangers into trusted companions. She placed one hand on the car door, believing that some beautiful chapters simply ended before anyone found the courage to change them. Inside the mansion, Ethan entered the library and immediately noticed the small velvet pouch resting on his desk. He opened it slowly and found the brass key lying inside exactly where Jasmine had left it. Beneath the key rested a neatly folded note written in her careful handwriting. "Thank you for trusting me with the place that mattered most. I hope one day you will discover that your heart deserves the same freedom you gave those memories." Ethan read the words twice before closing his eyes. His mother had once told him that every meaningful choice eventually arrived disguised as an ordinary morning. Standing alone in the silent library, he finally understood what she had meant. Without another moment of hesitation, he picked up the brass key and hurried toward the front entrance. The household looked on in surprise as the usually composed Ethan crossed the marble foyer with a determination none of them had ever witnessed. Outside, Jasmine had just settled into the back seat when she heard someone call her name. She turned to see Ethan walking quickly across the snow-covered driveway, his coat unbuttoned against the winter wind, the brass key still resting in his hand. He stopped beside the car, catching his breath before looking directly into her eyes. "The first night you entered my room," he said softly. I finished that sentence too late. Jasmine listened in silence as snowflakes drifted gently between them. Ethan smiled with quiet honesty. "Today I do not want to leave another sentence unfinished." He held out the brass key. "I spent years believing locked doors protected the people I loved. Then you walked through one by accident and reminded me that trust begins the moment someone is welcomed instead of kept outside." Jasmine felt tears gathering once more. Ethan continued, his voice steady but filled with warmth. "The room upstairs no longer needs protecting because the memories inside it are no longer lonely. Neither am I. Boston will always be there if that is where your heart leads you, and I will support that dream with everything I have. But before you decide, I need you to know the truth. Somewhere between the lilies, the old piano, and every quiet conversation we shared, you became the person who made this house feel alive again. If you choose to stay, it will never be because you work here. It will be because this is your home too." Jasmine looked at the key in his hand before gently closing his fingers around it again. "A key only matters when someone opens the door together," she whispered. Ethan smiled, and this time there was no hesitation, no guarded distance, only quiet joy. Side by side they walked back toward the mansion, where the front door stood open and warm light spilled across the snow. Behind them winter covered the gardens in peaceful silence, but beneath the frozen ground the white lilies patiently waited for spring, just as two hearts had quietly waited for the courage to bloom. And on that calm morning, the only room that truly opened was the one neither of them would ever close again.